December 17, 1944, Hurtgen Forest, Germany, 347 hours. General Major Friedrich Kittel stood in the command bunker 12 feet below the frozen earth, his breath visible in the lamplight, studying a map scattered with red markers representing American positions. He had been awake for 19 hours. His eyes burned. His uniform smelled of cigarette smoke and damp concrete. Outside, the forest was silent, except for the occasional crack of a tree branch breaking under the weight of ice. Kittel had commanded panzer units in Poland, France, and Russia. He had seen the German war machine at its height, when victory seemed not just possible but inevitable. Now, in the winter of 1944, standing in a bunker in German soil as enemy forces pressed from the west, he was trying to understand something that made no sense. The intelligence reports covering his desk told a story that violated everything he had been taught about warfare, about logistics, about the limits of industrial production. According to these reports, the Americans had landed more than 2 million men in Europe. They had brought with them 50,000 trucks, 30,000 tanks, 20,000 aircraft. They had established supply depots across France that held more ammunition, fuel, and rations than the entire German army possessed on the Western Front. And this was just the beginning. Every week, more ships arrived, more supplies, more men, more tanks. The numbers were absurd. They had to be exaggerated, inflated by American propaganda or Allied intelligence trying to demoralize German forces. Kittel had said as much to his staff 3 days earlier. The Americans, he had told them, were a nation of shopkeepers and farmers. They had industry, yes, but not the precision, not the engineering excellence, not the military tradition of Germany. They built cars and refrigerators. Germany built tigers and panthers. There was no comparison. His officers had nodded. They wanted to believe him because the alternative was unthinkable. But now, at just before 4 in the morning on December 17th, with American artillery beginning to thunder in the distance and reports coming in of massive enemy concentrations to the west, Kittel was beginning to suspect that he had been catastrophically wrong. The Americans were not shopkeepers. They were something far more dangerous. They were engineers with unlimited resources, and they had turned their entire continent into a war factory that dwarfed anything Germany could match. The artillery fire grew louder. The walls of the bunker shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Kittel looked at the map one more time, at the red tide of American units pressing forward, and understood with sudden clarity that Germany was not losing to better soldiers or superior tactics. Germany was being buried alive under an avalanche of steel, rubber, and gasoline that would not stop until every German position was overrun and every German soldier was dead or captured. The realization came too late. It had always been too late. The moment America entered the war, the outcome was decided. Germany just had not known it yet. If forgotten history fascinates you the way it once terrified the world, subscribe now so you never miss these true stories. To understand how Germany arrived at this point of industrial annihilation, you have to go back to the beginning, to the moment when German military leadership first assessed the threat posed by American entry into the war. The date was December 11th, 1941, 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag in Berlin and declared war on the United States, a decision that historians would later identify as one of the greatest strategic blunders in military history. Hitler was not concerned. He was confident. In his mind, America was a weak, decadent nation, divided by internal politics and racial tensions, a country that had avoided the crucible of modern war and therefore lacked the steel necessary to fight Germany. Hitler had said as much in private conversations with his inner circle. America, he claimed, was a mongrel nation, a mixture of inferior races that could never match the discipline and unity of the German Volk. American soldiers were soft, raised in comfort, lacking the warrior spirit that defined the German fighting man. American industry was impressive in peacetime, but would collapse under the demands of total war. This assessment was not unique to Hitler. It was shared across the German high command, from field marshals to division commanders, from intelligence analysts to frontline officers. The prevailing view was that America might provide material support to Britain and the Soviet Union, might produce weapons and supplies that would prolong the war, but would never pose a direct military threat to German forces. The reasoning seemed sound. America had no large standing army. In 1941, the United States military numbered fewer than 2 million men, compared to Germany's 6 million. American tanks were inferior to German designs. The M3 Lee medium tank, with its hull-mounted main gun and riveted armor, was a mechanical joke compared to the Panzer IV. American aircraft were adequate but unexceptional. The P-40 Warhawk was outclassed by the Messerschmitt Bf-109 in every performance category. American small arms were reliable, but lacked the precision engineering of German weapons. Even American steel production, while substantial, could not match the quality of Krupp steel. Germany had spent a decade preparing for war, building an armaments industry that produced weapons of unmatched quality. America was starting from scratch. This belief in German technological and industrial superiority was not baseless propaganda. It was rooted in observable reality. German engineering in the 1930s was the envy of the world. German machine tools set industry standards. German chemical companies pioneered synthetic materials that would later revolutionize manufacturing. German automotive engineers designed vehicles that pushed the boundaries of performance and reliability. The Autobahn system, the world's first high-speed highway network, was a testament to German engineering ambition. German universities produced engineers and scientists who led their fields in research and innovation. When the Nazi regime began rearming Germany in defiance of the Versailles Treaty, it drew upon this deep reservoir of technical expertise to create weapons that were, in many cases, genuinely superior to anything the Allies possessed. The Tiger tank, introduced in 1942, mounted an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Its armor, up to 100mm thick on the frontal glacis, was nearly impervious to Allied anti-tank weapons. German U-boats, equipped with advanced electric motors and schnorkel breathing systems, could remain submerged for weeks and evade detection by Allied destroyers. The Messerschmitt, Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, flew at speeds that left Allied propeller-driven fighters far behind. These were not incremental improvements over existing designs. They were revolutionary weapons that represented a qualitative leap in military technology. German commanders believed that this technological edge would compensate for any numerical disadvantages they might face. Quality, they reasoned, would triumph over quantity. One Tiger could defeat 5 Shermans. One Me-262 could destroy a dozen Allied bombers. One well-trained German soldier was worth 3 American conscripts. The mathematics seemed to favor Germany. This confidence was reinforced by early German victories that appeared to validate their doctrine. The invasion of Poland in 1939 took 4 weeks. Denmark fell in 6 hours. Norway lasted 2 months. The Netherlands surrendered in 5 days. Belgium held out for 18 days. France, the great military power that had dominated European warfare for centuries, collapsed in 6 weeks. These victories were not flukes. They were the result of superior German training, tactics, and equipment applied with ruthless efficiency. The Blitzkrieg doctrine, combining armored spearheads with close air support and mechanized infantry, shattered static defensive lines and encircled entire armies before they could react. The German war machine seemed unstoppable. By the end of 1941, Germany controlled territory stretching from the Atlantic coast of France to the outskirts of Moscow, from Norway to North Africa. It was the largest empire in European history, and it had been conquered in less than 2 years. Against this backdrop of success, the idea that America posed a serious threat seemed laughable. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest confidants, openly mocked American industrial capacity. In a speech to Luftwaffe officers in 1942, Göring dismissed reports of American aircraft production figures as fantasy. The Americans claimed they would produce 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 120,000 in 1943. Göring called these numbers propaganda lies designed to intimidate Germany. No nation, he insisted, could ramp up production so quickly. Aircraft manufacturing required precision tooling, skilled labor, and years of experience. America had none of these. They would produce planes, certainly, but those planes would be inferior in quality and limited in number. The Luftwaffe, with its experienced pilots and superior aircraft, would sweep American planes from the sky. Göring's confidence was shared by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the Kriegsmarine and architect of Germany's submarine warfare strategy. Dönitz calculated that if his U-boats could sink merchant shipping faster than the Allies could replace it, Britain would be starved into submission, and American supplies would never reach Europe. In 1942, German U-boats were sinking Allied ships at a rate of more than 600,000 tons per month. Dönitz believed that if this rate continued, the Allies would run out of shipping capacity within a year. He dismissed American claims that they were building Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels, at a rate of 3 per day. The numbers were impossible. Shipbuilding took months, sometimes years. A complex vessel like a cargo ship required thousands of man-hours of skilled labor. Even if the Americans could produce ships quickly, they would be shoddy, unreliable vessels that would break down in the Atlantic or fall victim to U-boat torpedoes. Either way, Germany would win the tonnage war. German army commanders shared this contempt for American military potential. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most experienced and respected field commanders, told his staff that American soldiers were poorly trained and poorly led. They lacked the combat experience of German troops who had been fighting since 1939. They lacked the ideological commitment of soldiers defending their homeland. They were conscripts, civilians in uniform, who would break under pressure. When American forces landed in North Africa in November 1942 as part of Operation Torch, Rundstedt predicted they would be quickly defeated by German Africa Corps veterans. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 seemed to confirm his assessment. German forces under the command of General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel inflicted a humiliating defeat on American troops, destroying over 200 tanks and taking thousands of prisoners. American soldiers fled in panic. American commanders made elementary tactical errors. The performance was so poor that even American officers questioned whether their forces were ready for combat against the Wehrmacht. German propaganda seized on the defeat, trumpeting it as proof that American soldiers were cowards who would collapse at the first sign of serious resistance. But Kasserine Pass was misleading. It represented not American incompetence but American inexperience, and inexperience could be corrected through training and combat exposure. What the Germans failed to understand or refused to acknowledge was that the American military was not a static entity. It was learning, adapting, and most importantly, growing at a rate that Germany could not match. Behind the American lines, beyond the immediate combat zones, an industrial transformation was underway that would render German calculations obsolete. The United States had entered the war with a relatively small military and limited armaments production, but it possessed something Germany lacked: vast, untapped industrial capacity and natural resources that could be rapidly converted to military production. American factories that had produced automobiles were retooled to produce tanks. Aircraft plants that had built commercial airliners switched to bombers and fighters. Shipyards that had constructed freighters began launching warships. This transition happened not over years but over months, driven by government contracts, corporate cooperation, and an engineering workforce that numbered in the millions. The scale of American industrial mobilization was unprecedented in human history. In 1941, the United States produced approximately 4,000 military aircraft. In 1942, that number jumped to 47,000. In 1943, it reached 85,000. In 1944, American factories produced 96,000 military aircraft, more than Germany and Japan combined produced during the entire war. These were not crude, hastily assembled machines. They were sophisticated combat aircraft like the P-51 Mustang, the B-17 Flying Fortress, and the P-47 Thunderbolt, planes that matched or exceeded German designs in performance while being produced in quantities that overwhelmed Luftwaffe defenses. American engineers had solved the problem of mass production without sacrificing quality by standardizing components, streamlining assembly processes, and training workers to specialize in specific tasks. The result was an assembly line that could produce a complete B-24 Liberator bomber in 63 minutes from start to finish. This was not an isolated achievement. It was replicated across the entire industrial base. Tank production followed a similar trajectory. In 1941, American factories produced fewer than 4,000 tanks. In 1942, production reached 25,000. By 1944, the United States was producing tanks at a rate of more than 2,000 per month. The workhorse of American armored forces was the M4 Sherman, a medium tank that German officers loved to disparage. The Sherman had thinner armor than German heavy tanks. Its 75mm gun was less powerful than the 88mm gun on the Tiger. In a one-on-one engagement, a Sherman would usually lose to a Tiger or Panther, but the Sherman was never designed to fight enemy tanks one-on-one. It was designed to be produced in overwhelming numbers, to be reliable enough to cross oceans and continents without breaking down, and to be simple enough that crews with minimal training could operate and maintain it. The Sherman succeeded brilliantly at these objectives. By the end of the war, the United States had produced nearly 50,000 Shermans. Germany produced fewer than 6,000 Panthers and fewer than 2,000 Tigers. The disparity was staggering. For every German heavy tank, there were 10 American medium tanks. This meant that even if a Tiger destroyed 4 or 5 Shermans before being knocked out, the Americans still came out ahead. The mathematics of attrition favored mass production over technical superiority. The same pattern repeated in every category of military production. The United States produced more trucks than all other nations combined, over 2.5 million vehicles that became the backbone of Allied logistics. American factories churned out small arms at a rate of millions per year, rifles and machine guns that equipped not just American forces, but also British, Soviet, and resistance fighters across occupied Europe. American shipyards launched warships and cargo vessels at a pace that defied belief. The Liberty ship program, dismissed by German naval commanders as impossible, produced more than 2,700 cargo ships between 1941 and 1945, with construction times eventually dropping to under 5 days from keel laying to launch. These ships, built using prefabricated sections and modular construction techniques, were not elegant or sophisticated. They were functional, mass-produced workhorses that could carry 10,000 tons of cargo across the Atlantic and be replaced within a week if sunk. The Germans sank hundreds of Liberty ships, but for every ship they destroyed, 2 more were launched. The tonnage war that Dönitz believed he was winning was actually being lost by an ever-widening margin. American industrial output did not just exceed German production, it buried it. In 1944, at the peak of wartime production, the United States manufactured more military equipment than Germany, Japan, Italy, and all occupied territories combined. American factories produced 40% of all weapons used by the Allied powers during the entire war. This included not just weapons for American forces, but also massive shipments to Britain under the Lend-Lease program, and to the Soviet Union, where American trucks, aircraft, and food supplies kept the Red Army fighting. The Soviet Union received over 400,000 trucks and jeeps from America, vehicles that motorized Soviet infantry divisions and allowed them to sustain offensive operations deep into German territory. American aviation fuel powered Soviet fighter planes. American steel reinforced Soviet tank production. Without American industrial support, it is questionable whether the Soviet Union could have survived the German invasion, let alone pushed back to Berlin. The same was true for Britain, which received billions of dollars worth of American equipment, food, and raw materials that kept the island nation in the war during its darkest hours. German intelligence officers tracking these production figures initially refused to believe them. The numbers seemed impossible, the product of Allied disinformation campaigns designed to create despair among German forces. Reports were filed, analyzed, and often dismissed as exaggerated. Even when photographic reconnaissance and captured documents confirmed the scale of American production, German commanders struggled to accept the implication. How could a nation that had been essentially disarmed in 1939 produce more weapons in 1944 than Germany, which had been on a war footing for over a decade? The answer lay in fundamental differences between American and German approaches to industrial production. Germany pursued perfection. German engineers designed weapons to be the best in their class, incorporating advanced features and tight tolerances that required skilled labor and precision manufacturing. This approach produced superior weapons but limited production capacity. A Tiger tank took twice as long to build as a Sherman and required 3 times as many man-hours. German factories could not simply increase output by hiring more workers because building a Tiger required experienced craftsmen who could work to exacting specifications. Training new workers took time, and time was something Germany did not have. American engineers took a different approach. They designed weapons to be good enough for the job and simple enough to be mass-produced by semi-skilled labor. The Sherman tank, for example, used a cast hull that could be produced by pouring molten steel into molds, a process that required less skill than the welded construction of German tanks. Components were standardized across different vehicle types, meaning that the same engine, transmission, and suspension systems were used in multiple designs. This standardization reduced production complexity and made maintenance easier. If a Sherman broke down in the field, replacement parts were readily available because thousands of identical components were being produced every day. German vehicles, by contrast, often used custom parts specific to individual models or even production batches, making field repairs difficult and replacement parts scarce. The American system was less elegant but far more practical for sustained warfare. The philosophical difference between German perfectionism and American pragmatism extended beyond weapons to every aspect of military logistics. Germany invested heavily in elite units equipped with the best available weapons and relied on these units to win decisive battles. The SS Panzer divisions, for example, received priority for new tanks, experienced crews, and ample supplies. These divisions were formidable in combat, capable of extraordinary feats when properly supported. but there were never enough of them to cover the entire front, and when they suffered losses, replacing the men and equipment took months. The American military, by contrast, distributed resources more evenly across all units. Every American infantry division had access to trucks, radios, artillery, and air support. Standards were consistent across the force. This meant that American divisions were less reliant on individual elite units and more capable of sustained operations across a broad front. If one division was exhausted or destroyed, another could be brought forward to take its place because every division was similarly equipped and trained. This difference in military philosophy reflected deeper cultural and economic realities. Germany was a nation of 90 million people with limited natural resources and an economy that had been weakened by World War I and the Great Depression. German industry was sophisticated but relatively small, concentrated in a few industrial regions that were vulnerable to bombing. Germany lacked the raw materials necessary for sustained industrial war. It had limited domestic oil production, forcing it to rely on synthetic fuel or imports from Romania. It lacked significant rubber production, forcing it to develop synthetic rubber substitutes. It had insufficient iron ore, requiring imports from Sweden. It lacked the aluminum necessary for aircraft production, forcing it to prioritize steel construction wherever possible. These shortages meant that German industry operated under constant constraints, juggling limited resources to meet competing demands from the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Priorities shifted based on immediate needs, creating inefficiencies and bottlenecks that limited overall production. The United States, by contrast, was a continent-spanning nation of 130 million people, blessed with vast natural resources. It had enormous oil reserves, particularly in Texas and California, that made it the world's largest oil producer. It had extensive iron ore deposits in Minnesota and Alabama. It had copper, aluminum, rubber, and timber in abundance. It had agricultural capacity that allowed it to feed its own population while exporting food to allies. Most importantly, it had an industrial base that was geographically dispersed, modern, and enormous. American factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and dozens of other cities had been producing consumer goods at mass scale for decades. These factories employed millions of workers who understood assembly line production and quality control. When the government issued war production contracts, these factories did not need to be built from scratch. They simply needed to be retooled, and retooling took weeks rather than years. The Ford Motor Company, which had pioneered assembly line manufacturing for automobiles, applied the same techniques to aircraft production, building B-24 bombers at its Willow Run plant in Michigan. At peak production, Willow Run was producing one complete bomber every 63 minutes, a rate that German aircraft factories could not approach. American engineers did not just copy existing designs. They innovated constantly, finding ways to simplify production, reduce costs, and improve performance. The Liberty Ship program, for example, revolutionized shipbuilding by using welded construction instead of riveted hulls. Welding was faster and required less skilled labor than riveting, and it produced stronger joints that were less likely to fail in rough seas. The use of prefabricated sections meant that components could be manufactured in different locations and assembled at the shipyard, streamlining the construction process and reducing the time from keel laying to launch. The first Liberty ship took over 200 days to build. By 1943, experienced shipyards were completing Liberty ships in under 2 weeks. The record, set by the SS Robert E. Peary, was 4 days and 15.5 hours from start to finish. This was not a one-time publicity stunt. It demonstrated that American industry had mastered the logistics of rapid, large-scale production in ways that Germany could not match. The impact of American industrial power became undeniable in 1943 as the war turned decisively against Germany. In North Africa, American and British forces defeated the Afrika Korps, capturing over 250,000 Axis soldiers. The victory was not due to superior German tactics being overcome by brilliant Allied maneuvers. It was due to logistics. Allied forces, supplied by convoys that crossed the Mediterranean, despite German air and naval attacks, had unlimited ammunition, fuel, and replacement equipment. German forces, cut off from reinforcements by Allied air superiority and naval blockades, ran out of supplies. Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, wrote bitterly in his diary that his troops were being starved into surrender while the Allies fought with warehouses full of supplies. The lesson was clear. Industrial power and logistics determined outcomes more surely than tactical brilliance. The invasion of Sicily and Italy in 1943 reinforced this lesson. Allied forces landed with overwhelming material superiority, supported by naval gunfire and air cover that German forces could not match. Every Allied infantry division that landed had thousands of trucks, hundreds of artillery pieces, and dozens of tanks. German forces defending Italy fought bravely and skillfully, using terrain to maximum advantage and inflicting heavy casualties on Allied troops. But they could not hold indefinitely because they lacked the supplies to sustain a long defense. German tanks ran out of fuel. German artillery ran out of shells. German infantry ran out of ammunition and medical supplies. Meanwhile, Allied forces continued to receive fresh supplies daily, landing on beaches and in captured ports, in quantities that seemed inexhaustible. German commanders watching this disparity began to understand that they were not fighting a conventional war where tactical skill mattered. They were fighting an industrial war where production capacity was the decisive factor, and Germany was hopelessly outmatched. The breaking point came in 1944, the year when American industrial power reached its zenith, and German military power began its final collapse. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 was the largest amphibious operation in history, landing over 150,000 men on French beaches in a single day. The logistics required to execute this operation were staggering. Over 5,000 ships transported men, vehicles, and supplies across the English Channel. Over 11,000 aircraft provided air cover and support. Within a month, the Allies had landed over 1 million men and over 170,000 vehicles. The Germans, watching from their defensive positions, were stunned by the scale of the operation. They had known an invasion was coming and had prepared extensive fortifications along the Atlantic Wall, but they had not anticipated the sheer volume of material the Allies could land and sustain. Within days, the Allies had established artificial harbors called mulberries that allowed cargo ships to unload directly onto the beaches. Within weeks, they had laid pipelines under the channel to pump fuel directly to France, eliminating the need for tanker ships. These engineering achievements, dismissed by German planners as impractical, proved devastatingly effective. German forces in Normandy fought with ferocity and skill, using hedgerows and fortified positions to slow the Allied advance. For nearly 2 months, the battle hung in balance as Allied forces struggled to break out of the beachhead. German panzer divisions rushed to the front, mounted counterattacks that inflicted heavy casualties and threatened to push the Allies back. But every German counterattack depleted irreplaceable resources. Every panzer destroyed could not be replaced. Every gallon of fuel burned brought German forces closer to immobility. By contrast, Allied losses were replaced within days. Destroyed tanks were replaced by new tanks unloaded from ships. Exhausted divisions were rotated out and replaced by fresh units. The material disparity became overwhelming. When the Allies finally broke through German lines in late July during Operation Cobra, the German defense collapsed not because German soldiers stopped fighting, but because they ran out of ammunition, fuel, and vehicles. Entire German divisions were surrounded and destroyed trying to retreat through the Falaise pocket. Over 50,000 German soldiers were killed or captured. Thousands of vehicles were abandoned when they ran out of fuel. The roads were littered with destroyed equipment stretching for miles. German officers who survived the battle described it as a nightmare where American firepower was so intense and so sustained that resistance became pointless. You could not hide because American aircraft found you. You could not fight because you had no ammunition. You could not retreat because you had no fuel. All you could do was die or surrender. Would you have survived in their place? Comment: I would try. The collapse in France was followed by disaster across the entire Western Front. Allied armies, supplied by an unbroken logistics chain that stretched from American factories across the Atlantic to French ports and then to the front lines, advanced rapidly toward Germany. The Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy operation, transported over 12,000 tons of supplies per day from Normandy to advancing American units, covering hundreds of miles over roads that had been destroyed by bombing and fighting. American engineers repaired bridges, cleared rubble, and reopened rail lines faster than German forces could destroy them. The Germans tried to slow the advance by destroying infrastructure, blowing up bridges and rail yards, but American engineering units rebuilt them within days. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the last intact bridge across the Rhine, was captured by American forces in March 1945 before German demolition teams could destroy it. The bridge stood just long enough for American units to cross in force, establishing a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine. When the bridge finally collapsed 10 days later, the Americans had already constructed pontoon bridges and ferries that maintained the flow of men and supplies. German commanders, watching this performance, realized they were facing an enemy that could not be stopped by conventional military means. Every obstacle was overcome. Every defense was outflanked. Every counterattack was crushed under superior firepower. German morale began to crack as soldiers recognized the futility of continued resistance. Intelligence reports from the final months of the war document a psychological collapse among German forces facing overwhelming American material superiority. Captured German soldiers described fighting against an enemy that seemed to have infinite resources. They spoke of American artillery barrages so intense that the ground shook continuously for hours. They spoke of skies filled with American aircraft that attacked anything that moved. They spoke of American infantry advancing behind walls of armor and supported by so much firepower that defensive positions became tombs. One captured German lieutenant, interrogated in April 1945, told his interrogators that German soldiers no longer believed they were fighting for victory. They were fighting to delay the inevitable, hoping that somehow a miracle would save them. But no miracle came. Only more American tanks, more American planes, more American supplies rolling forward in quantities that made resistance meaningless. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive operation, illustrated the futility of German resistance against American industrial power. In December 1944, Germany launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, hoping to split Allied forces and recapture the port of Antwerp. The offensive achieved complete tactical surprise, catching American forces off guard and creating a bulge in the Allied lines. German panzer divisions drove deep into American positions, surrounding the town of Bastogne and threatening to break through to the Meuse River. Hitler believed the offensive would force the Allies to negotiate a peace settlement, giving Germany time to develop new weapons and rebuild its forces. But the offensive was built on a foundation of wishful thinking and desperation. Germany lacked the fuel to sustain the offensive beyond a few days. German tanks were fueled using captured American supplies because German logistics could not deliver enough fuel to the front. German infantry lacked winter clothing and suffered terribly in sub-zero temperatures. German artillery had limited ammunition, forcing gun crews to ration shells. The entire offensive was a gamble that depended on capturing American supply dumps before running out of fuel. The gamble failed because American logistics proved unbreakable. Despite initial setbacks, American forces regrouped and counterattacked with characteristic material superiority. Supplies poured into the Ardennes from depots across France. American aircraft, grounded by bad weather during the opening days of the offensive, took to the skies as weather cleared and began systematically destroying German columns. The famous defense of Bastogne by the 101st Airborne Division was sustained by airdrops that delivered ammunition, medical supplies, and food despite German anti-aircraft fire. American armored divisions, led by General George Patton's Third Army, reoriented 90 degrees and drove north to relieve Bastogne in a logistical feat that German commanders thought impossible. You could not move entire armies that quickly, they said. The roads would be clogged, the vehicles would break down, the supply lines would collapse. But American logistics did not collapse. American engineers kept the roads open. American supply units delivered fuel and ammunition to advancing units. American mechanics repaired vehicles on the march. Within a week, the German offensive had stalled. Within 2 weeks, it was being rolled back. Within a month, German forces were retreating in disorder, having lost over 100,000 men and nearly 900 tanks they could not replace. General Major Kittel, standing in his bunker in the Hertgen forest as American artillery prepared to resume its bombardment, understood that the Battle of the Bulge had been Germany's last gasp. There would be no more offensives, no more grand maneuvers, no more opportunities to turn the tide. Germany was finished, buried under an industrial avalanche that began in American factories and ended on German soil. The mockery, the arrogance, the contempt that German commanders had shown toward American engineers and American industry had proven catastrophically misplaced. The Americans were not shopkeepers. They were the most formidable industrial power in human history, and they had turned that power toward a single goal, the complete destruction of Nazi Germany. Kittel looked at the map one last time, at the shrinking perimeter of German-held territory, and felt something close to despair. Germany had lost the war not on the battlefield but in the factories, in the shipyards, in the supply depots that kept Allied forces advancing no matter how fiercely German soldiers fought. This was not a war of honor or valor or tactical brilliance. This was a war of production, and Germany had been outproduced. The final months of the war were a slow-motion catastrophe for Germany as American and Soviet forces closed in from east and west. German cities were reduced to rubble by Allied bombing campaigns that dropped thousands of tons of explosives nightly. German industry, already crippled by shortages and labor problems, collapsed entirely as factories were destroyed and transportation networks were severed. German soldiers fought on because they had no choice, knowing that surrender might mean execution or imprisonment, but hoping that somehow they might survive long enough to see their families again. The German High Command, isolated in bunkers and disconnected from reality, issued orders for counterattacks and defensive stands that had no chance of success. Hitler, living in the Führer bunker beneath Berlin, refused to accept that the war was lost even as Soviet artillery shells exploded above his head. He blamed his generals for betraying him. He blamed the German people for lacking the will to fight. He blamed everyone except himself for the disaster that his decisions had created. In the end, he took his own life rather than face capture, leaving his subordinates to surrender unconditionally. The final accounting of World War II reveals the extent to which industrial production determined the outcome. The United States produced more than 300,000 aircraft, over 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles, over 2 million trucks, over 87,000 warships and landing craft, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. These numbers are so large they become abstract, difficult to comprehend in human terms. But to German soldiers facing this material tsunami, the numbers were devastatingly real. Every day brought more American supplies, more American vehicles, more American firepower. German production, by contrast, peaked in 1944 and then collapsed as bombing destroyed factories and Allied armies overran industrial regions. Even at peak production, Germany never came close to matching Allied output. In 1944, at the height of German war production, Germany produced 40,000 aircraft. The United States produced 96,000. Germany produced 27,000 armored vehicles. The United States produced over 50,000. And that does not include British or Soviet production. The disparity in industrial output translated directly into battlefield superiority. American units advanced with air cover that German forces lacked. American artillery fired barrages of unprecedented scale because ammunition was unlimited. American infantry attacked with tank support that German infantry could not match. American logistics delivered hot meals, medical supplies, and mail from home to troops at the front, maintaining morale even in the worst conditions. German soldiers, by contrast, fought on short rations with inadequate medical care and with the knowledge that they were being slowly ground down by an enemy they could not defeat. Letters and diaries from German soldiers in the final year of the war reveal a pervasive sense of doom, a recognition that defeat was inevitable and that survival was a matter of luck rather than skill. Many German soldiers deserted when given the opportunity. Others fought to the death not out of loyalty to the Nazi regime, but out of fear of Soviet retribution, or hope that dying in combat was preferable to life as a prisoner. The psychological impact of American industrial power on German commanders was profound and lasting. After the war, many surviving German generals were interviewed by Allied historians seeking to understand how Germany had lost a war it seemed to be winning in 1942. These interviews reveal a consistent theme. German commanders underestimated American industrial capacity and paid the price for that underestimation. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, captured at the end of the war, admitted in interviews that he had been shocked by the scale of American production. He had believed, based on intelligence reports and his own assumptions, that America would not be able to sustain high levels of production while maintaining a civilian economy. He had been wrong. America had mobilized its entire industrial base for war while maintaining civilian living standards that German citizens could only dream of. American workers went on strike for higher wages even while producing record amounts of war material. German workers, by contrast, labored under threat of imprisonment or death and still could not match American output. The difference was not just in resources, but in systems, in organizational efficiency, in engineering philosophy. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the German High Command, told interrogators that Germany's greatest mistake was failing to recognize that modern war was industrial war. Germany had prepared to fight a short war decided by initial victories and superior tactics. America had prepared to fight a long war decided by production and logistics. When the war did not end quickly, Germany found itself trapped in an industrial competition it could not win. Jodl believed that Germany should have made peace with the Soviet Union in 1942 and focused all resources on defending against the Western Allies. But Hitler's ideological obsession with destroying communism made such a peace impossible. By 1943, Germany was fighting a two-front war against enemies with combined industrial capacity 10 times greater than Germany's own. The outcome was predetermined. Only the timeline remained uncertain. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, provided perhaps the most damning assessment of German industrial failures. Speer had been tasked with maximizing German war production and had achieved significant increases through better organization and more efficient use of resources. But even Speer acknowledged that German production increases were marginal compared to the exponential growth in Allied production. He told interrogators that Germany never fully mobilized its economy for total war until it was too late. Civilians continued to work in non-essential industries, producing consumer goods until 1943. Women were not recruited into factory work in significant numbers, unlike in America and Britain where women made up a large percentage of the industrial workforce. German industry remained fragmented, with competing agencies and ministries fighting over resources and priorities. By the time Germany attempted full economic mobilization in 1944, Allied bombing had destroyed so much industrial capacity that increased production was impossible. Speer concluded that Germany lost the production war before the shooting war even began, and that no amount of tactical brilliance could compensate for industrial inferiority. The post-war consensus among military historians is that American industrial power was the decisive factor in Allied victory. Soviet blood and British determination were essential, but without American supplies, weapons, and logistics, neither Britain nor the Soviet Union could have sustained their war efforts. American industry not only equipped American forces, but also provided the material foundation that kept all Allied forces fighting. The Lend-Lease program delivered $50 billion worth of supplies to Allied nations, including over 400,000 vehicles to the Soviet Union, over 14,000 aircraft to Britain, and vast quantities of food, fuel, and raw materials to both. Stalin himself acknowledged in a toast at the Tehran conference that the war could not have been won without American trucks and American steel. Churchill told his advisors that American production had saved Britain from starvation and defeat. These were not diplomatic pleasantries. They were statements of fact. The lessons of World War II regarding industrial power remain relevant in the modern era. Military planners recognize that sophisticated weapons are useless if they cannot be produced in sufficient quantities to replace combat losses. The F-22 Raptor, considered the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, was produced in limited numbers because of its extreme cost, raising questions about whether the United States could sustain losses in a prolonged conflict. Modern conflicts have shifted toward precision weapons and technological superiority, but the underlying reality remains unchanged. Industrial capacity determines who can sustain a long war. Nations with deep industrial bases and access to resources can outlast technologically superior opponents who lack production capacity. This was true in World War II and remains true today. The German experience serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating opponents and overestimating one's own capabilities. German commanders believed their technological superiority and tactical excellence would overcome numerical disadvantages. They mocked American engineering and dismissed American production claims as propaganda. They learned, too late, that wars are won not by the side with the best weapons, but by the side with the most weapons and the logistics to deliver them where needed. This lesson, written in blood across the battlefields of Europe, should never be forgotten. Industrial power, unglamorous and often overlooked in favor of dramatic battlefield narratives, is the foundation upon which military victory is built. Germany forgot this lesson and paid with total defeat. America understood it and built an industrial machine that crushed every enemy that stood against it. General Major Friedrich Kittel did not survive the war. His bunker in the Hertgen forest was overrun by American forces in January 1945. According to American after-action reports, Kittel surrendered without resistance, walking out of the bunker with his hands raised as artillery fire pulverized the positions around him. He was sent to a prisoner of war camp in France, where he spent 2 years before being repatriated to Germany in 1947. He never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, but in private letters to a former staff officer, Kittel wrote that the moment he realized Germany had lost the war was not when Soviet forces entered Berlin or when Hitler committed suicide, but on that December morning in 1944 when he stood in the bunker looking at intelligence reports documenting American production figures. The numbers had seemed impossible then. Now they seemed inevitable. America had buried Germany under steel and fire, and German arrogance had hastened the burial. The mockery, the dismissiveness, the contempt that German commanders showed toward American engineers proved to be one of history's great miscalculations. Those engineers working in factories across America never fired a shot in anger, but won the war as surely as any soldier in the field. They designed the weapons, streamlined the production, solved the logistics, and built the material foundation that made Allied victory possible. They were not celebrated with parades or medals. They returned to civilian life after the war and resumed building cars, refrigerators, and washing machines. But their contribution was immortal. They proved that industry and engineering, properly mobilized and efficiently organized, are more powerful than any army. They proved that nations win wars not by having the best soldiers, but by having the most bullets, the most tanks, the most planes, and the supply lines to keep them fighting. And they proved that underestimating your opponent's industrial capacity is a fatal mistake. History remembers the great generals, the famous battles, the dramatic turning points. But history should also remember the engineers who designed the Sherman tanks, the factory workers who built them, the truck drivers who delivered them, and the supply clerks who ensured ammunition and fuel reached the front lines. These unglamorous heroes won World War II as surely as any infantry platoon or armored division. They understood that war is logistics, that battles are won before the first shot is fired by whichever side can produce more and supply better. German commanders learned this lesson far too late, and by the time they understood it, they were already buried under an avalanche of American steel. If this forgotten chapter of history moved you, if you understand now why industry defeats arrogance and why logistics matters more than tactics, subscribe so you never miss these stories. The engineers who won the war deserve to be remembered, and their lessons deserve to be learned. History teaches those willing to listen, and the lesson of World War II is clear. Mock your enemy's engineers at your peril, because the side that builds more wins, and America built more than the world had ever seen.